The brass letter opener quivers in Edward's worn fingers as he studies the document spread across his polished mahogany desk. The deed to Sandringham carries his name, not Charles's, and beneath the low amber light of the study, the dark ink appears almost alive. Every line, every flourish, every official mark points to a truth powerful enough to tear through the monarchy's carefully protected image. His phone vibrates across the desk yet again. Charles. Edward lets it buzz unanswered, his gaze locked on the royal seal pressed into the old parchment. He has lived in suspense for 24 years, waiting for the moment when the promise whispered to him by his mother at the edge of her life would finally make sense. Back then, her words sounded impossible. Now they blaze inside him. The land remembers who truly serves it. As midnight sounds from the grandfather clock, Edward knows the countdown has begun. In just 6 hours, palace lawyers will discover what he uncovered in the Queen's private papers, documents everyone assumed held little more than personal notes, faded charity correspondence, and family keepsakes. They were disastrously mistaken. Edward slides his fingertips along the embossed edge of the deed, feeling the raised marks of legitimacy. This is not a photocopy, not some fantasy, not an elaborate deception. It is the original transfer of a private estate, dated 3 months before the Queen's death, signed in her own hand and witnessed under Privy Council authority. Charles has no clue what is about to hit him. The silence shatters with the creak of the study door. Edward's pulse jumps as footsteps move down the hall toward him. In one practiced motion, he folds the deed and slips it into the inside pocket of his jacket, where it crackles softly against the silk lining. The footsteps stop directly outside. Then comes a measured knock. "Uncle Edward, it is Prince William. Father asked me to speak with you." Edward's jaw tightens instantly. Of course, Charles would send his heir first, a softer approach, a diplomatic opening move. But diplomacy will not save him tonight, not when the truth is resting over Edward's heart like a loaded weapon. He opens the door to find William in the dim corridor, still dressed in formal evening wear from the state dinner. The prince looks exhausted, but there is something sharper in his expression too, uncertainty, perhaps even dread. He already suspects something. Edward steps aside and lets him in. William's eyes move quickly over the room, lingering on the disordered papers scattered across the desk. "The lawyers called an emergency meeting for dawn," he says carefully. "They're talking about challenging some document they insist cannot possibly exist." Edward's reply comes cool and steady. "Lawyers are excellent at making uncomfortable truths disappear." William steps closer, the click of his shoes breaking the room's hush. "What did you find in grandmother's papers?" Edward studies him before answering. William has always seemed different from Charles, less trapped by formality, more capable of seeing the human side of duty. But blood ties and loyalty to the crown run deep. At last, Edward says, "I found proof that your grandmother never forgot her youngest son." William's face changes instantly. "The Sandringham transfer," he says, almost under his breath. "It's real." The admission hangs there, heavy and dangerous. Edward nods, his hand moving instinctively to the pocket where the deed rests. She knew Charles intended to consolidate everything under crown control. She saw exactly where this was heading. The cuts, the streamlining, the shrinking of this family into little more than Charles and his direct heirs. William runs a hand through his hair, disturbing the polished image he has worn all evening. "Father will fight it. He'll claim incapacity, pressure, manipulation, whatever he needs." Edward's voice turns to steel. "He can try. The deed is airtight, witnessed, sealed. Properly filed with the Crown Estate Commission. Your grandmother was many things, but careless was never one of them." The grandfather clock continues its relentless ticking as the two men stand in the growing tension of the room. Every second pushes them closer to dawn, and closer to the instant Charles will understand that his carefully laid plans are collapsing. William shifts uncomfortably and finally asks the question Edward knew was coming. "What do you actually want, Uncle? Money, more support, a better residence?" The words sting, though not because they surprise him. Everyone has always been quick to reduce Edward's motives to envy, pettiness, or greed. They never understood that some wounds cut far deeper than status. Edward crosses to the window overlooking the estate. In the distance, Sandringham House lies dark and still beneath the night sky, huge and silent as a sleeping creature. "I want what was promised to me," he says. "Tomorrow, those windows will reflect something entirely different, not just ownership, but recognition. Acknowledgement that I am still part of this family in more than name." William joins him at the glass. "You've always been family." Edward gives a bitter look to his own reflection. Older now, marked by years spent standing just beyond the center of things while Charles occupied every spotlight. "Have I?" he asks quietly. "When was the last time your father included me in a decision that mattered? When did he ask for my judgment on anything important?" William says nothing because there is no answer that can soften the truth. Charles has spent years pushing Edward to the margins, keeping him visible enough for ribbon cuttings, galas, and ceremonial appearances, but never close enough to influence the institution in any meaningful way. William's phone suddenly lights up. He glances down and goes pale. He's coming here now. Edward feels his pulse rise, but this time it is not fear that takes hold. Charles is moving through the night like a man used to getting his way, certain he can corner what he thinks is wounded prey. But tonight he has badly misjudged the situation. Good, Edward says, surprisingly calm. It's time. Moments later, headlights sweep across the study windows as a black sedan rounds the drive and comes to a halt. Several figures step out behind Charles, their silhouettes stark in the security lights. William edges toward the door. Uncle, maybe you should think this through. Edward closes his hand over the deed inside his jacket. I have thought this through for 24 years, he says. Tonight is when the thinking ends. Downstairs, the front door slams with enough force to shake the old glass in the study windows. Edward knows Charles will be in this room within moments, demanding answers, insisting on control, expecting obedience. But before he can reclaim the upper hand, he will have to confront the one thing he has spent his entire reign trying to outmaneuver: the truth of what their mother really thought about his vision for the future of the monarchy. Charles tears through the hallway with the force of a storm. His footsteps strike the marble floors like warning shots, and behind him 3 palace lawyers in dark suits struggle to keep pace, dragged from their beds to contain what he is convinced is just another attention-seeking act from his brother. Edward can hear every step from inside the study. One of the lawyers tries to intervene with a cautious tone, urging a diplomatic approach, but Charles's temper cuts straight through the corridor. Diplomatic. My brother is peddling forged documents claiming ownership of private royal property. There is nothing diplomatic about fraud. The study door flies open without so much as a pause. Charles fills the doorway in ceremonial uniform from the evening's event, medals flashing in the lamplight like armor. His face is flushed with anger, but Edward notices something else beneath it. Fear. Where is it? Charles demands. Edward remains seated behind the desk, calm and still, fingers lightly pressed together. Where is what, Charles? The king steps deeper into the room, the lawyers flanking him like sentries. The fake deed you've been waving around like some pathetic consolation prize. Did you truly think anyone would believe such an amateur forgery? Near the window, William looks deeply uneasy. Father, maybe we should just. Charles rounds on him in disbelief. Why didn't you call me the moment he showed you this nonsense? The room goes taut. William's loyalty hangs there, measured against years of habit and expectation. Edward watches the conflict pass over his nephew's face before William finally says, quietly but clearly, because it isn't nonsense. The words land like a blow. Charles says nothing for several seconds. Then, through clenched restraint, he demands, explain. Now. Edward reaches into his jacket and carefully places the deed on the leather surface of the desk. Under the warm light, the parchment seems to shine with an authority of its own, the seals and signatures visible even from a distance. Mother signed this 3 months before she died, Edward says. Sandringham, all 50,000 acres of it, transferred to me as a private inheritance, entirely separate from Crown holdings. One of the lawyers, a narrow man in wire-rimmed glasses, instinctively steps forward to inspect it. Edward's voice stops him cold. Touch it and I'll have you arrested for tampering with evidence. Even Edward seems faintly surprised by the force in his own voice. Charles moves toward the desk, his eyes scanning the parchment. Edward watches the moment recognition dawns. He sees Charles identify their mother's signature, the seal, the legal structure, the formatting no amateur could ever mimic. The confidence drains from him. This is impossible, Charles says at last, almost inaudibly. She would have told me. We went over the estate arrangements in detail. Edward's answer cuts precisely. Did you go over them, or did you explain your plans while she listened? The distinction slices through Charles's assumptions. He has always mistaken silence for support, believing his mother's restraint meant agreement with his strategy for modernizing the institution. Edward knows better. He knows silence often meant she was thinking 3 moves ahead. Desperate for a weakness, Charles reaches for another line of attack. She was 96, hardly in a condition to make complicated legal decisions. Edward opens a manila folder and spreads medical documents across the desk. Her physician's full cognitive assessment from the same week. Excellent mental capacity. No evidence of decline. No diminished judgment. The lawyers exchange quick, grim glances. Edward can almost hear the legal calculations happening behind their eyes. With every document he produces, their optimism fades. Charles leans heavily on the desk. Why? He asks. Why would she do this without telling me? Edward's voice softens, but only slightly, because she knew you would never understand. That answer seems to drain more strength from Charles than the deed itself. Suddenly he looks older, the ceremonial uniform hanging awkwardly on shoulders bent by shock. Understand what? Edward rises and crosses to the window, where Sandringham House remains outlined against the thinning night. That your streamlined monarchy is not just about saving money, he says. It's about erasing anyone who does not fit neatly into your design of what this family should be. Charles begins to protest, but Edward cuts in before he can finish. When was the last time you brought me into a serious conversation about the future? When did my opinion matter to you? There is no answer. They both know it. For years, Edward has been pushed aside, treated as expendable, a relic of an older royal era, useful for appearances but excluded from purpose. Charles tries to recover his footing. You chose to step back. Edward's voice finally rises. No, I was pushed back. Every idea dismissed, every offer of service deflected, every effort to contribute politely smothered, while you and your advisors made decisions about my life, my role, and my future. William watches, stunned, as decades of buried tension finally erupt. The lawyers remain frozen, silent witnesses to a reckoning that could redraw the monarchy's internal balance overnight. Charles straightens as if royal instinct can still rescue him. The crown requires unity. Personal grievances cannot, Edward interrupts, sharp and cold. Mother's personal feelings just removed 50,000 acres of prime estate from your reach. That seems relevant to unity, doesn't it? The reminder strikes hard. Charles turns back toward the deed, scanning for an error that is not there. The Crown Estate Commission will never accept this, he says. I'll challenge it in court. Edward meets him calmly. On what basis? Mother was fully competent. The transfer was properly witnessed and filed. The estate was her private property, not Crown land. She had every legal right to leave it as she wished. One of the lawyers finally clears his throat. Your Majesty, if I may, the document appears entirely valid. To challenge it, we would need evidence of fraud or coercion, and at present there is no such evidence. Charles turns on him instantly. Then find it. The lawyer does not flinch, but his answer is final. Sir, we cannot invent proof that does not exist. The medical records, the witness statements, the filings, every element supports the transfer. The room falls still again except for the clock. Charles stands in the center of that silence, realizing this is not merely a property dispute. It is something far more personal and far more damaging. His mother made a final judgment about how he intended to lead the family, and she acted on it. Edward watches him with no real triumph. This was never about humiliating his brother. It was never about revenge. What he wanted was acknowledgement, proof that he was more than a ceremonial extra in an institution served by generations of their family. Eventually, Charles looks up, exhausted. What do you want? Edward answers without hesitation. What mother intended me to have: respect, recognition, a voice in decisions that shape the family's future. Charles's eyes harden. And if I refuse? Edward's hand drifts to his pocket again, where more documents wait. Then tomorrow morning, the press learns about the second document she left me. Charles goes white. What second document? But Edward says no more. He has shown enough for one night. The first blow has landed. Now Charles must sit with the knowledge that there is more, and that whatever remains may threaten not only his pride, but the stability of his reign. Some truths are more effective when they arrive in stages, and Edward has spent nearly a quarter of a century waiting to choose the moment. As dawn begins to wash pale light through the study windows, Edward finally reveals the next piece. It is a private letter from the Queen, sealed with her personal ring and dated only days before her death. Charles stares at the familiar handwriting as if each word might ignite on the page. He begins to read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. My dearest Edward, if you are reading this, then Charles has finally learned the truth about Sandringham. But the property transfer is only the beginning of what I have put in place for you. Behind him, the lawyers shift uneasily. Their confidence from earlier has evaporated. William stands by the window, silent, watching his father's world come apart one revelation at a time. Charles reads on, his hands trembling now. I have watched my eldest son steadily shut you out of meaningful participation in our family's work. That was never my intention when I raised you both to serve. A monarchy that abandons its own blood abandons part of its soul. Charles breaks off. She didn't understand. Edward's reply is immediate. Keep reading. Charles swallows and continues. I have therefore arranged for your financial independence and permanent place within our family structure. The private investment portfolio of the Duchy of Lancaster, valued at approximately $200 million, will pass to you upon my death. This transfer bypasses the Crown and cannot be challenged by royal prerogative or parliamentary intervention. The sentence detonates in the room. £200 million, enough to free Edward from any dependence on Charles's approval, enough to fund his own royal work without seeking permission. One of the lawyers drops his briefcase with a crack that ricochets through the study. Charles looks up, stunned. That cannot be lawful. The duchy investments are tied to the Crown's finances. Edward produces yet another document. Mother separated the private portfolio years ago. She placed it into a family trust, fully detached from official royal holdings. Her legal advisors assured her it was entirely proper. Charles's voice rises in disbelief. She consulted lawyers behind my back. Edward's answer is cool. The same firm that handled private royal matters for 3 generations. The same advisors who worked on your personal financial arrangements when you were Prince of Wales. That hypocrisy lands harder than Charles wants to show. For decades, he justified building private wealth as essential to royal independence. Now he is forced to confront the fact that his mother applied exactly the same reasoning to protect Edward. William is the one who breaks the silence. Father, maybe this is an opportunity. Charles turns sharply. An opportunity? Your uncle has just claimed £200 million of family money and our most valuable private estate. In what universe is that an opportunity? William answers with brutal clarity. Because if you fight this publicly, it will destroy us. The press will feast on a royal inheritance war, while families across the country are struggling with rising costs. Every tabloid will frame it as greedy royals battling over fortunes, while everyone else worries about paying bills. The political reality cuts through Charles's emotion at once. He knows William is right. His carefully shaped image as a modern, relevant sovereign could fracture overnight if this battle spills into public view. The British public has very little patience for royals appearing to quarrel over wealth. Edward watches the strategic calculations moving across his brother's face. Charles may be stubborn, proud, occasionally deaf to how he is perceived, but he is not foolish when it comes to optics. He understands the danger. Finally, he asks, "What are your terms?" Edward is ready. "Full restoration to active duties," he says, "not ceremonial filler, real work, meaningful patronages, a proper voice in family meetings about the monarchy's direction. In return, I say nothing publicly about Mother's reasons for arranging these transfers. The press hears nothing about the concerns she had regarding your plans." Charles flinches visibly. The leverage is unmistakable. Edward possesses not only wealth and land, but their mother's written judgment of Charles's leadership, criticism that could undermine his authority if made public. "You're blackmailing me," Charles says. Edward shakes his head. "I'm offering partnership. Mother wanted both of us involved in the future of this institution. I'm making sure her wishes are respected." One of the lawyers nervously suggests discussing the legal implications in private, but Charles cuts him off with a flat, exhausted command. "Get out, all of you." The lawyers leave quickly. William hesitates, then follows, casting one last anxious look at his father before the study door clicks shut behind him. The sound feels final, almost carceral. Charles sinks into the chair opposite Edward's desk. The ceremonial uniform that looked so commanding a few hours ago is now rumpled and tired. In the stark morning light, the medals seem strangely theatrical. "She planned this perfectly, didn't she?" he asks, hollowed out by the answer even before Edward gives it. Edward nods. "She spent months arranging everything. The lawyers, the timing, the order in which the documents would appear. She made sure you could not wave it away or bury it quietly." Charles looks stricken. "Why, what did I do to deserve that kind of betrayal?" Edward pauses. He could list every slight, every exclusion, every moment of dismissal, but the truth is more layered than grievance. "She was not betraying you," he says. "She was trying to save you from yourself." Charles looks up sharply. "Explain." Edward does. "Your reduced monarchy leaves room only for your direct line. But what happens when William becomes king? Do you think he will want you looming nearby forever, offering opinions, second-guessing his every move?" The question lands with a force Charles did not anticipate. He has never really considered that the philosophy he used to push Edward aside could one day be turned against him. History is full of former monarchs and sidelined royals rendered inconvenient by the next chapter. "Mother understood that families need more than one active generation," Edward says. "She wanted to make sure that when your reign is over, you do not end up exactly where you placed me. Ignored, reduced, politely put aside." Charles says nothing for a long time. The grandfather clock strikes 7, marking another hour in a night that has become the longest and most bruising of his reign. At last he says, "The press will learn about the transfers eventually. They always do." Edward nods. "Yes, but how they learn matters. We can shape the story if we move together. We present it as Mother's final effort to preserve family unity, her way of strengthening the monarchy across generations." Charles's voice turns wary. "And if I refuse?" Edward's expression hardens. "Then they learn about her private concerns regarding your leadership, her documented fear that you are dismantling traditions without understanding why they existed. The threat is no longer hidden. Charles knows he is facing a choice between sharing power or risking the collapse of authority. Public disclosure of his mother's criticism could trigger an avalanche of political and personal fallout. "You've trapped me," he says. Edward corrects him gently. "No, I have positioned both of us to succeed, if we are wise enough to take the path she left us." Charles rises and moves to the window, staring out at Sandringham as the morning sun catches the old stone. Somewhere inside the house, staff are beginning their routines, unaware that the family they serve has just undergone a dramatic internal shift. "What happens now?" he asks. Edward joins him at the glass. "We announce that Mother's final wishes included provisions for shared responsibility and family unity. We present the transfers as her gift to strengthen the monarchy, and your modernization plans, we review them together. We keep what works and discard what doesn't. We act as partners, not ruler and subordinate." Charles studies his brother's face. For the first time in years, he sees not the sidelined younger son he had grown used to dismissing, but a possible ally, someone capable of carrying the burden of modern monarchy with him rather than resenting it from a distance. Mother always said you were the clever one, he murmurs. Edward gives the first faint smile of the night. She also said you were the one with the vision. Perhaps it is time we stopped acting as though only one of us could matter. When William returns and reports that the lawyers need instructions on the filings, Charles looks from his son to his brother and makes the decision out loud. Tell them we are accepting the transfers as lawful expressions of the Queen's final wishes. No legal challenge, no delay. William's eyebrows lift in disbelief. Father, are you sure? Charles answers with a steadiness that surprises even him. Your grandmother understood family better than any of us. If she believed this arrangement would strengthen the monarchy, then we honor it. But even as he says the words, he knows the night's upheaval is not over. Edward's victory may be complete on paper, yet royal victories have a way of opening doors to consequences no one anticipates. And that truth lands only harder 3 hours later, when another secret emerges from the Queen's private safe, hidden behind a false panel that Edward somehow knew existed. Compared with what comes next, the estate and the money begin to look almost secondary. The final document is a second will. Charles stares at it in disbelief. She wrote another will, Edward nods gravely, sealed and witnessed just like the first, but this one addresses what the official document could not: private judgments, personal truths, family matters that could never pass through ordinary legal channels. The parchment trembles in Charles's hands as he reads his mother's final assessment of her children, written in the careful script that guided the monarchy for decades. Every sentence is precise, unsparing, and devastatingly honest. Charles possesses the ceremonial gravity required for kingship. He reads aloud, voice thinning, but lacks the emotional instinct to understand what the crown truly means to ordinary people. His reforms, however well-intentioned, risk turning the monarchy from a beloved institution into a cold corporate structure. William shifts uneasily near the fireplace, watching his father absorb criticism his grandmother never delivered this bluntly in life. Morning light pours into the room now with no mercy at all, illuminating every mark of fatigue and every crack in Charles's composure. He continues, more quietly. Edward understands by instinct what I learned over decades, that the crown draws strength not from authority but from service, not from distance but from connection. He possesses the common touch Charles has never fully mastered. Edward speaks softly. She wrote that 3 days before she died, her last judgment on both of us, witnessed by her physician and private secretary. Charles lowers the pages. Why are you showing me this? His voice is hollow. Haven't you humiliated me enough for one day? Edward steps closer, serious now rather than triumphant, because the next paragraph explains why she arranged everything the way she did. Charles reads on and his face loses color. I leave Edward the means to challenge Charles when necessary and the security to support him when appropriate. The monarchy requires both correction and continuity, wisdom and innovation. Neither of my sons alone possesses all that is needed to carry the crown through what lies ahead. In that instant, the entire night changes shape. Their mother was not choosing one son over the other. She was engineering dependence between them, forcing cooperation where competition had calcified over decades. The inheritance was neither reward nor punishment. It was a design, a system built so neither man could truly succeed alone. She played us, Charles whispers, though there is now the faintest note of admiration beneath the shock. Edward shakes his head. She saved us, from ourselves, from each other, from the mistakes we were both making. William, listening from across the room, asks the question neither older man expected. What mistakes? Charles and Edward exchange a long look, as if only now realizing how much their rivalry has defined them. Edward answers first. Your father was turning the monarchy into a business. Efficient, modern, tidy, yes, but colder. People do not love businesses the way they love families. Charles turns the question back. And you? Edward does not evade it. I was becoming bitter. The sort of sidelined royal who eventually writes memoirs or gives interviews designed to wound. Mother saw where that road ended and cut me off before I could do real damage. Silence settles over all three men as they absorb the sophistication of the Queen's plan. She identified each weakness and built a solution that addressed both, forcing Charles to include Edward while giving Edward enough stake in the institution's success to prevent sabotage born of resentment. Charles sets the will aside and goes to the window again, looking out at gardeners beginning their work as if the world were unchanged. The press will find out eventually, he says. They always do. Edward answers. Then we decide what they are told. We present this as her final masterstroke, her gift to family unity, her way of keeping the monarchy connected to ordinary life by making us partners instead of rivals. William, now beginning to understand the scale of it all, adds that the arrangement could even have constitutional advantages. A financially independent prince operating alongside the reigning sovereign but not dependent on him is unusual, but not impossible. Edward points out that it is not without precedent. Earlier generations of royals maintained independent households and real influence without collapsing the institution. Charles's strategic mind begins slowly to see possibility where he first saw only threat. A privately funded working prince could shield the monarchy from some criticism over cost. Critics who accused the crown of excess would be forced to admit that part of its public-facing work was being paid for privately. The prime minister will have questions, Charles says. Edward's answer comes with unexpected firmness. Then the prime minister will adjust. Mother's arrangements are legal and constitutionally sound. The government can work with the reality or waste itself challenging what it cannot defeat. William steps closer to his father and says what perhaps no one else could. This could actually strengthen you. Sharing authority with Uncle Edward would show confidence, not weakness. It would prove you're secure enough to accept challenge and counsel. The observation lands. So much criticism during Charles's early reign has centered on his apparent need to control every part of royal life and his reluctance to delegate anything meaningful. Edward's rise as a genuine partner might solve more than one problem at once. There remains, however, the issue of presentation. How do we explain your sudden return to prominence? Charles asks. Without admitting Mother staged all of this from beyond the grave, Edward calmly produces another paper, this one on the letterhead of the Queen's private secretary. She prepared for that too. It is a sealed recommendation for expanded duties, drafted 6 months before her death and withheld until the right moment. Charles reads it with something close to awe. Every obvious objection has already been answered. Every future criticism has been neutralized in advance. Even in death, she is still protecting the institution with the patience and precision that defined her reign. She thought of everything, Charles murmurs. Edward gives a dry reply. She had 96 years to understand how this family works. She knew exactly how we would react to each stage and how long it would take us to get past our pride. The clock strikes 9, underscoring just how fully the internal dynamics of the monarchy have changed in a single night. Outside, the estate continues as normal. Inside the study, the old order has been rewritten. Charles returns to his chair, visibly drained. What happens now? Edward answers simply. Now we begin the real work, together, the way Mother always intended. Yet Charles understands that this new partnership demands something harder than shared strategy. It requires him to accept that his mother's criticism was not merely rebuke. It was warning, perhaps even prophecy. The path forward will require not only his ambition and vision, but Edward's steadier wisdom. And by noon, the hardest test of all arrives. Edward opens a leather-bound diary filled with the Queen's familiar handwriting. She kept records, he says gently. Every family meeting you held without me. Every decision made about my role without consultation. Every time you chose protocol over brotherhood. Charles's voice barely carries. She wrote all of it down. Edward nods and begins to read. March 15, 2021. Charles announced today that Edward would no longer be included in succession planning discussions. When I questioned him, he called it efficiency, but I saw the real reason in his expression, fear that Edward's perspective might disrupt his vision. Charles grips the arms of his chair until his knuckles white. Hearing his mother's private observations feels like being dissected in public, every insecurity laid bare by the one person who understood him too well to be fooled by his rationale. Edward turns another page. A king surrounded only by agreement is a king moving toward failure. Edward's questions, his alternate perspective, his inconvenient truths, these are not hindrances to Charles's success. They are necessary to it. By the window, William watches with growing shock, realizing his grandmother had documented the family's dysfunction with almost scientific precision. The polite smiles, the silences, the moments she appeared simply to acquiesce, all of it had been recorded and interpreted. Edward reads another entry. May 8, 2022. Edward offered to lead the Commonwealth Youth Initiative. Charles dismissed the suggestion without discussion, insisting it required more senior oversight. But I know the true cause. Charles fears Edward's natural warmth with younger generations may expose his own struggles to appear accessible. The accuracy of it lands physically. Charles remembers the meeting, remembers his irritation, remembers dismissing Edward almost automatically, not because of sound judgment, but because of instinctive competition. She saw everything, Charles says quietly. Edward replies, everything, including this 2 months before she died. I have decided Edward must be given independent means to serve the crown, whether Charles approves or not. My eldest son's inability to move beyond his insecurities is becoming dangerous to the monarchy's future. If he cannot learn to share power willingly, he must be required to share it. The diary closes with a finality that feels judicial. Charles sits in stunned silence under the weight of his mother's disappointment. Decisions he once believed were strategic now stand exposed as weakness dressed up as discipline. Why didn't she just tell me? He asks eventually. Edward responds by placing a stack of typed memos on the desk. She tried. These were sent to you over the last 3 years. Suggestions, nudges, warnings that I should be brought in more fully. You acknowledged them politely and then ignored them. Charles recognizes the papers immediately. He had filed them away as evidence of his mother's sentimental attachment to an older family model, never recognizing them for what they were. Increasingly urgent attempts to stop him from isolating both Edward and himself. William breaks the silence with startling directness. Grandmother was protecting the monarchy from both of you. Both men turn toward him. He continues without flinching. Father, you were becoming autocratic. You shut out opinions that didn't fit your assumptions. And Uncle Edward, you were becoming resentful enough to hurt the institution just to make your point. The words sting because they are true. Edward knows he had begun contemplating bigger, riskier moves to force recognition, gestures that could easily have turned into a public crisis. She designed a way to save you from your worst instincts, William says. Father gets a partner willing to challenge him. Uncle Edward gets real purpose and independence without having to break anything to be seen. Charles moves to the fireplace and stares at portraits of earlier monarchs who faced their own family tests. He feels the weight of history bearing down as he imagines how future generations will judge this moment. Finally, he asks, the public announcement. How do we tell this story without admitting Mother essentially staged an intervention from the grave? Edward has already thought that through. We focus on partnership and continuity. We say these private arrangements reflect the Queen's wish for family unity and stronger service to the public. We emphasize that expanded duties are privately supported, reducing strain on taxpayers. Charles nods slowly. The key, he realizes, is narrative. If presented correctly, this can look like thoughtful evolution, not internal collapse. Then Edward says there is one more thing, something their mother wanted Charles to know only after he had accepted everything else. He opens the diary to its final entry, dated 2 days before her death, and hands it over. Charles reads with trembling hands. Charles, if you're reading this, then you have learned the hardest lesson of kingship. True strength lies not in exclusion, but in inclusion. Edward is not your rival, he is your anchor. By giving him independence, I have given you the greatest gift possible, a brother free enough to tell you the truth because he no longer needs anything from you except respect. Those words strike harder than the criticisms. This is not condemnation. It is love, guidance, faith in the king she still believed he could become. She still believed in me, Charles says, his voice thickening. Edward answers softly, she believed in both of us. She just knew we needed help believing in each other. For a moment, the room is silent except for the faithful ticking of the clock. Outside, the estate carries on. Inside, two brothers finally begin to find a way back to one another through the wisdom of the mother who understood them better than they understood themselves. Charles closes the diary and looks at Edward directly. Partners. Edward nods. Partners. They shake hands, but neither man yet realizes that the Queen's final and most explosive secret is still waiting in a sealed envelope, marked for one condition only, to be opened if her sons ever learn to work together. The envelope lies hidden in the oldest safe on the estate, and when the ornate Victorian mechanism clicks open, it sounds almost violent in the stillness. Charles stares at the writing on the front, to be opened only if my sons learn to work together. Edward breaks the wax seal with hands that are no longer fully steady. Inside is not a legal paper, but a photograph. It slips free and lands between them. Their father, young and unmistakable, stands beside a woman who is not their mother. In her arms is a baby. Both adults are smiling with obvious tenderness. Who is this? Charles whispers. The woman is striking, warm-eyed, deeply at ease. Edward turns the photograph over and reads the note in their father's handwriting. Kesha Williams and our daughter Amara, June 1968. My heart belongs to them both. The room seems to tilt. Another daughter, another branch of the family, a sister neither of them knew existed. Edward finds more inside the envelope, a stack of letters tied with blue ribbon, each addressed to my beloved Kesha. Charles opens the first and reads words of longing he never heard his father speak aloud in public life. He dreams, the letter says, of a world where they can live openly, where Amara knows her true heritage, where love matters more than duty. It is dated 2 years before their parents' engagement became public. The implication is devastating. Their father's heart belonged elsewhere, and royal obligation, tangled with the prejudices of the era, forced him to leave that life behind. He loved her, Charles says, stunned. He truly loved her. Edward nods as he scans more letters, each one painting the portrait of a romance broken by institution, race, and expectation. Duty won, but at an enormous human cost. He lifts another photograph, one showing their father teaching a little girl to ride a bicycle. Her face is full of joy, her posture uncannily familiar. Charles studies her features and sees it at once. The jawline, the determined set of the shoulders, the unmistakable family resemblance. She's our sister, he breathes. Edward gives the formal distinction, half-sister, but his tone makes clear that it hardly matters. Blood is blood, family is family. Among the papers is a note from the Queen that makes the revelation even more astonishing. She writes that she knew about Kesha and Amara from the beginning. Philip told her everything before they married, and she agreed to the arrangement because duty demanded sacrifices almost impossible to bear. yet she always believed the family might one day be made whole when the world had changed enough. Charles sinks heavily into his father's old chair, trying to absorb what this means for everything he thought he knew about his parents' marriage. The union he had always seen as solid and dutiful was in fact an arrangement entered into with full knowledge that his father's deepest love belonged elsewhere. Where are they now? He asks. Edward searches the papers and finds more recent correspondence. Kesha Williams died 5 years ago, he says quietly, but Amara is alive. She's 55, lives in Atlanta, and works as a social worker specializing in foster care placement. The irony is immediate and painful. While Charles and Edward spent years among donors, dinners, and ceremonial obligations, this unknown sister dedicated her life to vulnerable children, exactly the kind of practical service their mother always said gave the monarchy real purpose. Does she know? Charles asks. Edward shakes his head. According to the letters, Philip visited for years in secret but never told Amara her true heritage. He feared the truth would destroy the ordinary life he wanted her to have. Charles continues through the photographs, birthdays, graduations, small private moments stolen from official duty. In every image, Philip looks happier than Charles remembers him being at home. He had 2 families, Charles murmurs. One for duty, one for love, Edward adds, and mother knew all along. She covered for him, helped arrange visits, even sent Christmas gifts through intermediaries. Suddenly their parents' marriage looks less like romance and more like a long, disciplined collaboration built to preserve the institution while quietly protecting a love that could never be publicly recognized. Then comes another shock. Edward lifts a recent legal document. There's more. Father created a trust for Amara, £50 million held through a private Swiss bank. Charles reads the terms with the practiced eye of a man used to private financial structures. It is not merely support. It is inheritance, with provisions extending to Amara's children and grandchildren in a pattern that closely resembles arrangements made for acknowledged royal descendants. He recognized her, Charles says, stunned all over again. Legally, financially, in every way that matters. Edward nods. The study goes silent as the magnitude of the hidden family branch settles over them. Their family is no longer just the known line, the visible line, the official line. It includes people who share their father's blood and legacy but have lived entirely outside the royal story. Charles moves to the window once more, though this time the estate itself seems almost trivial compared with what has just surfaced. The careful image he has spent his life trying to protect suddenly feels hollow beside the authenticity his father preserved in secret. What do we do? He asks. Edward joins him. We honor father's love and mother's wisdom. We reach out to Amara. Charles starts to mention constitutional implications, but Edward cuts him off. This is not about titles. She is not seeking position, and she doesn't even know we exist. This is about family. Charles thinks through the political and cultural ramifications, the inevitable scrutiny, the racial history, the media frenzy if the truth ever breaks. Yet looking at the photographs of Philip's genuine joy, he knows some things matter more than convenience. We contact her quietly, he decides. No press, no announcement, just brothers speaking to their sister. Edward agrees, though both understand the decision cannot be undone. Once the connection is made, nothing about their family or the monarchy will ever be quite the same. Charles dials the Atlanta number with unsteady fingers while Edward watches from across the room. Both men understand that this call could begin healing a wound hidden for more than half a century or create a new one. A woman answers. Her voice is warm, professional, touched by southern ease and something uncannily familiar. Ms. Williams, Charles begins, faltering briefly. This is going to sound impossible, but my name is Charles Windsor, and I believe we may be related. Silence stretches over the line. He can hear distant traffic, ordinary American life continuing while he drops a revelation that could rewrite everything she understands about herself. I'm sorry, who is this really? She asks, plainly skeptical, the voice of a woman who has likely dealt with enough strange calls in the course of social work to trust none of them. Charles glances at Edward, who nods. Did your mother ever tell you about a man named Philip? An English gentleman who visited when you were young. The pause that follows is longer. When Amara speaks again, her voice is quieter, more careful. How do you know about Philip? Charles answers gently, because Philip was our father, which makes you our half-sister. For a beat there is nothing but the sound of her breathing. He imagines her trying to reconcile childhood memory with something that sounds absurd. You're lying, she says at last, though her tone suggests she is trying to convince herself. Edward leans closer to the phone. Amara, this is Edward, Charles's brother. We found photographs in father's papers. You learning to ride a bicycle, birthday parties, Christmas mornings. He never forgot you. Charles adds, and yes, this makes matters complicated, but it also makes you our sister, and we would very much like to meet you. He hears her sharp intake of breath. The worldview she has carried for 55 years is shifting under her feet. This is insane, she whispers. You're telling me the man who visited twice a year and signed cards as Uncle Philip was the King of England. Edward gently corrects the title issue. Philip, of course, was never king, but yes, he was Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, and according to the letters they found, he loved her and her mother deeply. Silence falls again. Charles imagines her office around her, papers and case files and personal photographs, all suddenly sharing space with the impossible fact that she belongs by blood to Britain's most famous family. Then Amara says something unexpected. The trust fund, the anonymous trust fund that helped pay my daughter's college tuition and my son's medical bills. That was him. Charles confirms it. £50 million established the year she was born, administered through Swiss banks to preserve secrecy. He could not publicly claim her, but he never stopped providing for her. Amara's voice breaks. He said he worked in import-export, traveled for business. My mother would smile every time he said it, like they shared a joke. I was too young to understand. The pain in her words reaches Charles in a way no constitutional briefing ever has. Here is a woman who spent decades believing her father was a distant but decent businessman, never knowing that protocol and prejudice had forced a permanent divide. Edward explains that they found letters he wrote but never sent, letters in which he wanted to tell her everything, but feared the truth would destroy her ordinary life and make her prey to media and restrictions. Ordinary life, Amara says with a humorless laugh. You mean the life where I've spent 30 years helping children abandoned by their families, never realizing why their pain felt so personal to me. The remark hits with terrible force. She has built a career healing the very wounds royal secrecy inflicted on her. Charles chooses his next words carefully. We would like to meet if you are willing, privately, quietly, just family. She repeats the word as if testing it. Family, I have brothers in England, royal brothers. Edward adds softly, you have nephews too, William, Harry, and their children, a whole family who never knew about you but who would have welcomed you if given the chance. Charles waits, feeling the weight of the moment. This is the hinge on which everything turns. If she rejects them, the truth remains a wound. If she accepts, it changes all of them. I need time, she says at last. This changes everything I thought I knew about myself. Charles quickly tells her to take all the time she needs. They are not asking her to change her life. They only wanted her to know she has brothers who care. Brothers, she repeats, and this time the disbelief has softened into wonder. Edward then tells her something else she deserves to know. The Queen knew about her from the beginning. She helped arrange Philip's visits. She sent gifts through trusted intermediaries. She hoped the family might one day be whole. Charles adds that finding Amara was in many ways their mother's final wish. Another long silence follows, but when Amara finally speaks, there is a new steadiness in her voice. I want to meet you, but not in England, not in some world of protocol and cameras. Somewhere private where we can just be family. Charles and Edward exchange looks. For men raised to bring everyone into the royal orbit, this is a complete inversion. To make this work, they will have to step into her world instead. Where? Charles asks. Amara suggests a lake house in North Georgia, about 2 hours from Atlanta, owned by a friend who will be away. A weekend there, she says, no press, no ceremony, no official choreography. The idea alarms every instinct shaped by royal security, but it also stirs something more human. We'll come, Edward says before Charles can worry aloud about logistics. Next weekend, she asks. She needs time to arrange cover for her cases. Charles agrees at once. They will handle travel. Then comes the most intimate question yet. What do I call you? She asks Charles uncertainly. Your Majesty, sir. For the first time since the impossible day began, Charles smiles without effort. Call me Charlie. That's what father called me when we were alone. She repeats it softly, and somehow the simple name makes all of this feel more real than any title could. After the call ends, the brothers sit in silence again, this time not with hostility but with awe. They have just agreed to a secret reunion in another country with a sister they did not know existed, away from security rings, away from media management, away from the machinery of royalty. Edward finally says, Mother would be pleased. Charles nods, though he knows the hardest part is only beginning. Reaching Amara was one step. Building something real after 55 years of concealment is another. The following weekend, the lake house in Georgia waits among tall pines like a world apart from palace life. Its rustic stillness bears no resemblance to the gilded rooms Charles and Edward have known all their lives. Amara Williams stands on the dock as a small rental boat crosses the water toward her. No photographers, no officers, no aides, just 3 middle-aged siblings about to discover what family means when stripped of title, expectation, and carefully managed image. As Charles steps onto the dock, Amara looks at him and says the one thing both brothers have been dreading and hoping to hear. You look like him. Her voice carries a soft southern cadence that somehow makes the moment gentler. Edward follows, studying her face for signs of their father. She is smaller than he imagined, dressed simply in jeans and a university sweatshirt, but she carries herself with a quiet dignity no royal finishing could improve. And in that instant, with the water behind them and decades of secrecy between them, the monarchy's most guarded family learns that the truths hidden longest are often the ones that matter most.